Coming up, the EOB is DOA. A post-mortem on how to kill a bill.
You're listening to Brent's 2 Cents, the semi-serious thoughts of a guy in Belize. And now here's the host of this podcast from somewhere in Belize City, Brent Toombs.
Hey, welcome to the podcast for the week of September the 28th. Well, here we are just 3 days away from the reopening of the Philip Goldson International Airport. Meanwhile, our local COVID infection rates continue to go up. But I'm afraid that a lot of people are getting fixated on recovery numbers and falsely believing that the danger has somehow passed, which is certainly not the case. Just a couple of days ago, we had 52 new infections. Now, the reason the total number of active cases is dropping as rapidly as it is because in August, we were reporting 80, 90, nearly 100 new cases daily. So yes, we will begin to see a decline in the number of active cases now. That's just how math and time works. But until we start to see consecutive days with no new infections, please don't get lulled into a false sense of security. Now, maybe it's just me, but I get a feeling that somehow between the September celebrations and the airport reopening, that a lot of people have decided that they're done with social distancing. And that worries me, because that's the same thing I was sensing back in June and July. And well, we all know what happened in August. Now, it will be very interesting to see what happens in the next few weeks. Already churches and restaurants are allowed to open their doors to 10 people at a time. And we're also seeing lobbying from the Belize Tourism Industry Association to further relax restrictions, essentially calling for a complete reopening of just about everything. Well, that didn't work out a few months ago when we had less than 50 active cases in Belize. So what do you think is going to happen now with over 600? I'm also watching to see what happens with our land borders as the election looms closer. I think there's going to be pressure from within to open the borders just in time for those registered voters in Guatemala and maybe Mexico to cross over on Election Day. Now, on episode 11, I talked about how COVID-19 has derailed many of the usual ways that politicians manipulate the voters list. And I think a closed border could deprive certain candidates of several hundred votes, which, when you look at how close some of the races have been historically, that could be the difference between victory or defeat. But an even greater concern for me is that once our land borders are open, that they will stay open until there's a serious spike in new infections, which most likely would come within a few weeks, as many Belizeans would no doubt flock to Chetumal and Melchior. And if our northern border is open in November, just imagine the potential for a super spreader event like the 12 days of Buen Fin in Mexico. But on to the main topic I want to talk about this week, and that's the Equal Opportunities Bill. Not so much about the bill itself, but what happened and how a small group of mostly evangelicals managed to kill what was a very progressive and much needed piece of legislation that was designed to protect all of us from various forms of discrimination. Plain and simple, the bill was killed by lies. Bald-faced, fingers crossed behind your back while you swear on your mother's grave, lies. The lies got started back in January, as soon as public consultations began. The first big lie that got told was that if the bill becomes law, that people would be arrested, jailed, and fined up to $10,000 for simply offending someone, or for holding a particular belief that was contrary to what someone else believed. And then within a few weeks, somehow those fines had climbed to $20,000, according to the hosts of the Rise and Shine morning show on Plus TV. Now, there was not even a shred of truth to those lies, and anyone who bothered to actually read the bill would have seen that, first of all, the Equal Opportunities Bill was not even a criminal bill. It was civil. So not only could nobody ever be arrested on the basis of a complaint, but also the resolution process did not involve fines or other penalties until long after the offending party had reneged on the agreed remedy mediated by the commission. And even then, the maximum penalty that a tribunal could impose was only $5,000. In other words, if you discriminated against an employee or a tenant, and the commission told you how you could make it right, and you still did nothing to stop discriminating against that person or group of people, then there was the possibility that the complaint against you could get elevated to a criminal court, who would determine if your lack of compliance with the instructions of the commission constituted a criminal offense. Merely discriminating would not be illegal, but ignoring the decision of the commission would be. That's no different than what happens when you get a traffic ticket. Parking in a no parking zone is not a crime, but ignoring the fine imposed by the traffic court is. The next big lie, and this was really the crux of the matter for the National Evangelical Association of Belize, was that the Equal Opportunities Bill was only designed to protect members of the LGBT community. Never mind that there were 18 other protected classes of people included in the bill, from pregnant women to persons with disabilities, to people living with HIV, to the elderly, even people of religious faiths, including the very pastors that were campaigning to kill the bill, were protected. But if you listened to the talk shows or attended the public consultations that were stacked with people bussed in by certain churches, all you heard was LGBT this and LGBT that, and that is probably the biggest reason why these holy warriors were able to kill the Equal Opportunities Bill. They filibustered with their lies and their chicken little predictions of Sodom and Gomorrah like ruination being wreaked upon Belize if the bill became law. One evangelical missionary in Punta Gorda recently live-streamed for nearly an hour, making up all sorts of unbased claims that the Equal Opportunities Bill would be the end of democracy in Belize and the beginning of communism, and that all freedoms in our country would cease to exist, and that the Bible would be considered a hate book. His rant-filled video, which by comparison would have made Alex Jones or Glenn Beck look sane even on their most manic and paranoid days, was viewed by over 1,000 people, many of whom joined in with their own cyber version of pitchforks and torches. And of course, none of them had actually read the bill. Instead, they all preferred NIAB talking points, as devoid of reality as they were, because as Lewis Wade and Scott Sturm know better than anyone, never let facts get in the way of your opinions. Both those men have made careers by following that advice. But as any of us who actually bothered to read the bill would have known, the draft legislation is full of exemptions. There is nearly as much in the bill about why you could not be guilty of discrimination as there is about defining what discrimination is and who is vulnerable to be discriminated against. There is very detailed language about reasonable accommodation. Things like how a small or micro enterprise can't be expected to absorb the financial burden of making their offices wheelchair accessible, if doing so would cause that business to suffer. Or common sense scenarios about how sporting events can continue to have gender segregated teams. But the biggest set of exemptions of them all was a virtual free pass for churches and their clergy. Yes, that's right. Under the proposed bill, churches would be almost completely exempt. They could continue to preach their faith based on their own belief system, even if that meant delivering a sermon about how homosexuals should burn in hell for all of eternity. Freedom of speech and freedom of religion was completely protected in the Equal Opportunities Bill. No church school was going to be required to alter what they teach, and no church would be forced to rent their facilities to any group they had a problem with. No pastor would be required to perform a same-sex marriage. And the bill even specifically made mention that nothing in the proposed legislation would affect the Marriage Act. In fact, the Equal Opportunities Bill would have given religious groups special rights that they currently do not have. But just like the disabled or the elderly or women, this particular group of fanatical evangelical pastors have no problem throwing the babies out with the bathwater, if it means keeping gays and lesbians in their closets and reinforcing their message that LGBT Belizeans are not full citizens of this country. If you're a woman, you should be pissed. If you have a disability, you should be pissed. If you're in a common law relationship or have children outside of marriage, you should be pissed. If you're elderly, you should be pissed. If you support a political party, yeah, you should be pissed. If you're living with HIV, you should be pissed. And if you're a person of faith that doesn't subscribe to the very specific version of Christianity practiced by 16% of the population, you should be pissed. We should all be pissed that a handful of right-wing fundamentalists boiled the entire Equal Opportunities Bill down to one hot stove issue: the gay agenda. Because that's what mobilizes their base. And that's what makes Scott Sturm and Lewis Wade and their cabal of like-minded pastors appear relevant. This is about power for them. And when Prime Minister Barrow and his cabinet capitulated on September 15th and decided not to bring the Equal Opportunities Bill to Parliament, they handed the National Evangelical Association of Belize the power they so desperately crave. By making enough noise, a relatively small group of men and a few hundred blind faith followers managed to hijack the National Assembly. While they ranted and raved and made up wild lies about some dystopian version of Belize where thought police would arrest and imprison you, the rest of us sat there and did nothing. There was very little pushback from vulnerable groups. There was hardly any visible support for the bill at all. Not just from people who would benefit most from the bill, but from ordinary, right-minded Belizeans who actually believe that non-discrimination would be a good thing. So the Kill the Bill crowd was able to run with the idea that there was massive opposition against the Equal Opportunities Bill. Because really, that's pretty much the only voices that made any noise. Or at the very least, the only voices that got heard. And that's how you kill a bill in Belize. Now, the truly tragic thing about all of this is that I don't know if the Equal Opportunities Bill, or some 2.0 version of it, will ever get this close to the House of Representatives again. When the Barrow cabinet kicked this can down the road, they created a monster in the form of the evangelical churches. Will any future administration be willing to spend the political capital necessary to revive this anti-discrimination legislation, knowing what sort of shitstorm they are starting with one small but very vocal faction of the faith-based community? That's certainly something I plan to ask candidates of all political parties when they show up at my gate seeking my vote in the weeks ahead.
We want to hear from you. You can find Brent's 2 Cents on Twitter and Facebook at 2 Cents Belize, or email us at podcast@oshaproductions.com. That's OXA Productions with an S.com.
So now you may have noticed that I'm always mentioning about subscribe to Brent's 2 Cents wherever you get your podcasts. So I want to take a moment to talk to you about why you should be using a podcast app and how that will benefit you. You see, Brent's 2 Cents has been listened to just over 6,000 times, which is incredible for an independent podcast intended for a small market, and considering that podcast consumption is still something that's not that common in Belize. But when I look at the stats of who's listening, The one thing I notice is that about 70% of you are listening to my podcast via website links. That means you probably saw a Facebook post and clicked on that link. That's probably how you are hearing this episode right now. Now, I'm grateful for listeners any way I can get them. But clicking through on a Facebook post or a tweet is not the best way to enjoy podcasts. You see, not only does that post need to show up in your feed, but you have to see it at a time when it's convenient for you to click that link and then spend the next 20 minutes or so listening to this show. And if you're outside your home, then you're going to have to be using your mobile data to listen. Now, the whole idea of podcasts is that it should be listening on demand. I like to say it's like Netflix for your ears, except that you don't need to beg your bra Lee to share his password. There are hundreds of thousands of excellent podcasts available, all completely free. And the best way to find the shows you like and to keep things organized is by using a podcast app on your mobile device. If you have an iPhone, you already have a podcast app built in. But there are also a number of really good podcast apps available for free for both Android and iOS. Once you download a podcast app, all you have to do is find the shows that you want to hear and hit subscribe. Now you'll automatically be notified every time those podcasts release a new episode. And if you set your app to automatically download new episodes, your favorite podcast will be stored on your phone or device without you needing to do anything. This is great for listening to podcasts while you're out of the house, maybe commuting or exercising, or even while you're at work if you want to hear something other than your chatty office mates. I have my podcast app set to download new episodes at 5 a.m. every morning. So by the time I get up, my phone is already loaded with new shows that I can enjoy anytime I want. So if you're not using a podcast app to listen to this episode, do yourself a favor. After the show is over, go to Google Play or the Apple App Store and get yourself a podcast player. Then subscribe to Brent's 2 Cents and all your favorite Belizean podcasts, plus whatever else you're interested in hearing. It might be comedy like The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, or a series on true crime, or news from around the world, or podcasts about movies and TV shows, or even the latest mixtape from popular DJs. There is a whole world of really great podcasts just waiting for you to discover them, once you get yourself a podcast app. Hey, I want to say thanks to everyone who sent in messages last week for the special Independence Day episode. The response was amazing, and I especially want to thank those of you who took time to contact me or left comments about how much you appreciated that episode. I also want to big up all my fellow Belizean podcasters, especially those of you who dropped new episodes in the last week, like the Natasha Stewart podcast and the Parody Project. And a big welcome to the newest show coming out of Belize, The Gentle Perspective by Roneisha Gentle. Now she's doing a video podcast, so you can find her over on YouTube, and I'll post a link in the description for this show. The first episode of The Gentle Perspective is about the role that music plays in trying to make up for a lack of substance in political campaigns in Belize. It's definitely a great topic, considering the general election call could come any day now. Remember, you can be part of the podcast movement in Belize by sharing this show with at least one person who otherwise may not know about it. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. You can contact me anytime on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at 2 Cents Belize. Or leave me a voice message to play on next week's episode by clicking on the link that you'll find in the description for this show. You can also contact me by WhatsApp, and that number is also in the show description. Finally, I want to say thanks to Carla and Kareem for supporting this podcast by buying me some coffee. The great thing about podcasts is they are free to listen to, but they do cost a few bucks to license music, to host them on the internet, and to promote them. And those costs start to add up, especially after 13 weeks. So just a couple of dollars from listeners like you really helps me out. If you'd like to chip in, you can buy me a coffee for just $3 US or $6 Belize. And you'll find the link for Buy Me a Coffee in the description for this show. And that's going to do it for episode lucky number 13 of Brent's 2 Cents. I'll have another episode for you next week. But until then, please stay home as much as possible. Wash your hands, wear your mask, and most importantly, be nice to each other.
Brent's 2 Cents is a presentation of OSHA Productions, Belize's affordable professional video production company.